So my name is Brian Meacham. Thank you for joining this roundtable discussion on reimagining the ICC Performance Code. The attendees in this roundtable session are in the energy and mechanical, electrical, plumbing space. We have a range of people who represent engineers, who represent associations. We're on the plumbing side, energy side, electrical and mechanical. And the idea of these sessions is to really kind of get a sense of what different disciplines on the engineering side and also on the review side and others think about performance-based building codes, think about performance-based design, where they're at as a discipline, where things are going as part of the ICC effort to think about reimagining where we might go with performance-based building codes and associated with that performance-based building design in the US. And so I don't expect to do a lot of talking today. I'm hoping mostly the discussion will be from you all. I have sent out probably too much information, but overview on some questions to kick off discussion today. I've provided some background information. I can go over more of that if people would like, but what I'd like to do is kind of go around the group and have a brief introduction and basically who you are, who you're working with or for, what your specific discipline or interest is, and why you're interested in this effort by the ICC. And just to kick it off a bit, my name's Brian Meacham. I've been engaged as a contractor for ICC to work on this effort. I've been working in performance-based regulation and design for about 30 years or so, worked on code committees in the US and internationally, and the intent is to kind of, look at what best practice is in performance and both the regulation and the engineering side, and see how we could use that knowledge and take a forward-looking approach to the process. So with that, I'll go around the room based on names that I see up on the screen. I have a couple of people who have telephoned in, so I don't necessarily have the names of those people, but we'll catch them at the end. So I'll just start off going through the names. So I'll start with Chris Baker.
Hello, I'm Chris Baker. I'm a licensed architect and licensed engineer at Willdan. We provide energy efficiency programs on behalf of utilities and work in performance-based programs. So they're always model-based results. We also work with the state of Minnesota for an outcomes-based, so a measured energy consumption-based energy standard for all public bonded buildings. So anybody who gets state bond funding has to comply with an energy use intensity requirement, either through renewable energy or energy efficiency.
Thank you. Kimberly Cheslak.
Hi, Kim Cheslak, Director of Codes at New Buildings Institute. We have been highly engaged in ICC development, primarily in the energy code space. So just excited to join you guys here today to understand where the performance code might be going and how we can assist in using that to advance buildings.
Thank you very much. Michael Rosenberg.
Yeah, hi, I'm Mike Rosenberg. I lead the Building Energy Codes program at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. I'm a new member of the IECC committee, actually the alternate member for PNNL on the commercial code. and I've been working on development of ASHRAE Standard 90.1 for about 20 years, specializing in the energy cost budget subcommittee, which is responsible for performance-based codes in that standard. And the work at the codes team at PNNL has been, I think, trying to lead the effort on a transition to performance-based energy codes, both whole building and system performance.
Thank you very much. Amy Boyce.
Good afternoon. I'm Amy Boyce. I work for the Institute for Market Transformation and also lead the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition. My background is in mechanical engineering and have also spent some time working on LEED energy credits, as well as some time with existing building performance. Our work at IMT has centered recently a lot on building performance standards for existing buildings. And so we have a lot of interest in how that works with building codes and measuring actual performance in buildings.
Thank you. Kyle Thompson.
Yes, hello, Kyle Thompson. I'm with Plumbing Manufacturers International, PMI, and I actually just started with them in July, mid-July, so I've been here for several months. And before that, I was with IAPMO for 10 years on codes and standards development. I think my main representation on this committee will be in the plumbing and possibly some mechanical space. Yeah, so that's what I'm here for. And I'm interested in getting involved in performance code-based development. It's for me been mostly prescriptive requirements. So we'll see where we go. Thanks.
Thank you. Dan Nichols.
Good afternoon. My name is Dan Nichols. I'm a fire protection engineer, and I'm also the acting vice president, assistant vice president for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority Fire, ADA, and Code Compliance Group. We oversee the regulatory requirements of all construction regarding the MTA, which services transportation facilities in the greater New York area, as well as southwestern Connecticut. And we service what you commonly known as the New York City subway system, the commuter railroads, and the bridge and the tunnel systems. We have a renewed interest in performance-based design due to our interface with infrastructure and public works projects. And we are very interested in looking for paths to adopt a more performance-based design and a multitude of disciplines that generally have been very prescriptive in our world. So I'm very excited to be here and look forward to it, Brian.
Thank you very much. Mark Frankel.
Hi, this is Mark Frankel. I'm with Ecotope Inc. in Seattle. We are a research, policy, and engineering firm. We work on mechanical engineering and plumbing engineering as well, and we try to apply performance in both cases. But prior to being with Ecotope for the last 2 years, I was 15 years at New Buildings Institute, and for the last 12 or 15 years, I've been proselytizing outcome-based codes for energy performance. I know a number of people on this call have had those conversations with me over the years. Outcome being, measured actual performance as opposed to model performance, which we call performance-based code. So prescriptive, performance, and outcome-based is sort of the tiers. And I've helped write an outcome-based code for the city of Boulder, and was working with the state of California on a transition to an outcome-based code that kind of fell apart during COVID, but maybe it'll get reestablished. And the AIA adopted a goal of having an outcome-based code in place by 2027, I think, in one of their position papers. And the state of Washington has adopted requirements for building performance within 5 years of completion that is essentially acting as an outcome-based code in my mind. So maybe I'm talking a little bit further down the road in terms of outcome-based code versus performance code, but I totally support moving to performance first. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Rick Sullivan.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks, Brian. I'm Rick Sullivan. I'm the Director of Design and Engineering for the Department of State, U.S. Department of State Overseas Buildings Operations. So OBO for short. We are in charge of all of our embassies and consulates overseas. So my job is design engineer, and I oversee our technical standards, scope development, design overview, and then technically help construction and then facilities during the O&M phase of all of our work overseas. We use the ICC kind of as our base code. We've always, like everybody else, been more prescriptive. We've been talking about going performative for a long time. I think we have on a few small things here or there, but it's a tough nut to crack, as I'm sure all you guys know. So interested to see where this conversation goes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jim Kinzel.
Hi, I'm Jim Kenzel, and I'm representing both the American Supply Association, which is the association mainly comprised of wholesaler and distributor organizations, companies within the US, serving the plumbing, heating, cooling, and piping industry, and also represent Hardy, Heating, Air Conditioning, Refrigeration Distributors International, which is more focused, wholesaler distributor association, more focused specifically on the actual movement of air in heating and air conditioning. So I've spent my entire career, which is longer than I will admit, in product standards development and model code development, and really strived over that career to develop the concept of one standard, one test for a product. So there's a national acceptance and criteria for the same product across the country, whether that's a plumbing product or a air conditioning product or what have you. And so I struggle somewhat with the concept of the performance-based code, because I'm not sure how that doesn't lead to inconsistencies on when you accept products or don't, and all of a sudden you have different subjective criteria for products based on who's developing the performance code or who's interpreting it and who's determining how you get to the outcome. So that's my concern about product, and I'm hoping that discussions with this group will hopefully alleviate those concerns. I have had a lot of experience also in the development of management systems, which is a little less prescriptive than the product standards and that. And I also have experienced the difficulty in getting a management system type standard into a existing model code, whether it's a plumbing code or building code. There is a conflict between the typical management system standard, which is probably leans more towards a performance standard, than the more prescriptive typical codes we deal with. So a lot going on there. So I'm very interested to hear what everybody has to say on the whole concept of performance codes and standards. Thank you.
Thank you. Philip Ferry.
Good afternoon. My name is Philip Ferry. I am with the EPSEC Energy Research Center in Cocoa, Florida. We're a research institute of University of Central Florida. I have been here working with buildings research for the last 40 years, a little bit more than 40 years. Florida has performance-based code systems, both in residential and commercial building arena, and my institute has been intimately involved in the development of those code standards over time. And I'm a former chairman of ASHRAE 90.2 and an active member of that committee as well as the 62.2 committee of ASHRAE on ventilation for indoor air quality. And so I'm very interested to see what kind of progress can be made with this working group. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Russell Thomason.
Good afternoon. So Russell Thomason with Department of State, OBO. I am one of Rick Sullivan's mechanical engineers. And my background is that I've worked with the development of the Unified Facilities Criteria and Unified Facilities Guide specifications for Department of Defense and NASA eons ago when they first established it. I was also involved in NFPA 99, the 2012 edition, when we took it from standard to a code. And currently I'm on the ASSE 12,000 committee, involved in developing the standards and the testing criteria for certification purposes. So I'm happy to be here and glad to hear all the wonderful expertise in the room.
Thank you. And Roy Wilson.
This is Roy Wilson. I'm with OBO. I work with Rick Sullivan, and I'm in the design engineering and electrical engineer. I'm a registered PE, certified energy manager. And I'm also involved in our lessons learned for updating our standards based on lessons learned. Just to let you know, I'm a little skeptical of performance-based spec because early in my career, I had some bad experiences where they were written by others. It was designed by people that were not experts, and I was the site engineer that had to correct all those problems. So I'd like to hear what you have to say. That's all.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody on that I haven't asked for an introduction? Great. So I think we've got everybody who is able to join today. We've got quite a range of designers, users, research, people who are looking forward to performance, people who are skeptical about performance approaches. And I think that's really what we're trying to get here, is to get a range of views and perspectives. And it's a little bit mixed here, MEP and energy. I think, however, we did the grouping because a lot of the issues are related for this group in particular, but of course for energy, there's a lot of overlaps into other areas as well. I think what I'd like to kind of kick off with, and I think we've heard, some of this already from the different introductions, is, just kind of get a range of the views on what a performance building code in your mind, really means. And, what do you think about kind of performance-based design in order to meet that code? And we have the ICCPC already here in the US. It's not really adopted by any jurisdictions, but it's a framework document that allows for the performance to be done. And so I'm hoping there's a bit of kind of organic discussion around this to get going. We'll try to maybe use the hand raising so I can pick on people, but if there's somebody who would like to kind of kick off on, we've heard a couple of comments about performance versus outcome-based codes and what that means. Maybe there would be a good place to start.
This is Chris Baker. I think one of the challenges, and I wholeheartedly support both performance outcomes. I'm a little nervous about the cost of complying after the fact and documenting it. But one of the things that is necessitated by performance-based codes is greater sophistication by the authorities having jurisdiction. It's a lot easier to look at a checkbox and say, is it there or is it not? It's a lot more challenging, on an energy is where I know verifying that an energy model was done appropriately and that the combination of measures is going to be compliant and that there wasn't any game played. And so I think you put more onus on the reviewers than there is on a prescriptive approach.
This is Mark Frankel. Let me speak to that for just a moment. So one of the reasons that I've been pushing for outcome-based codes for energy is that at this point, you know, half or more of the energy use in buildings has to do with operation and unregulated loads and things like that. And so with the kinds of goals that have been set around the country for code performance, we have to be able to address some of those other loads, if you will. And so the way we set it up in Boulder, for example, was we had a prescriptive backstop that was essentially ASHRAE 90.1. And you basically had to incorporate all the usual things that you would incorporate for prescriptive code. And then you had to verify outcome or, you know, EUI performance down the road, a year or two down the road. And that, you know, that gives the developers incentive to incorporate features on building operation that are totally outside the scope of prescriptive code review. And in some ways, I think if we went to that metric, to an outcome, it actually gets easier for the code reviewers because they can focus on really simple, you know, the key measures are incorporated in the building and there's an energy model that predicts the outcome, but the outcome is actually inherent on the developer to prove out later. And there's been different discussions about whether there's a performance bond or temporary certificate of occupancy, other mechanisms. It's challenging, of course, that would drive the incentive to have the buildings perform as anticipated. So that's sort of the distinction between performance and outcome. But I think if you just go to performance, as Chris says, it becomes inherent that the authority having jurisdiction have a pretty sophisticated understanding of energy modeling if that's the end of the enforcement process.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Mark. You don't have to argue about whether the model is right or not if you just have to wait 12 months to see what the actual meter says.
It becomes an incentive for the modeling to be accurate if it actually is measured later, that's a big deal in performance pathway because you can look at plenty of performance models that actually don't really represent actual building outcome as it stands now. And that's because there's no feedback or incentive for modelers to get anything right about how the building's operated. I mean, this has been true since the early days of LEED when they got sued because LEED buildings were not performing the way the energy model said they were going to be, which that lawsuit was based on a paper I wrote, actually.
Should I weigh in?
So, yeah, we have Jim and then Kim, and we'll get you both in. So Jim, go ahead. Jim Kinzel.
Yeah, this is Jim Kenzel again. So it may be helpful to me to hear somebody define, I mean, number one, I didn't think there was a difference between a performance and an outcome. I thought one of the main benefits of a performance code is that it's outcome driven, that it has specific metrics to measure the end, I guess, for lack of a better term. So I'm a little confused as to what the difference between a performance code and an outcome code would be. It implies to me that performance codes then do not have outcomes, which I thought was one of the things that performance codes provided. And that said, the other piece of it, which goes back to my original introduction of myself, and I can't remember the gentleman who was giving an example of how his state does it, but that example, okay, you're using the baseline prescriptive code followed by a performance code. Now that I can understand, right? So, but when I just look at the international ICC performance code, and if I look under plumbing, for instance, which is one of my areas that I'm involved with, I go, there's no way any plumbing inspector or any plumbing code official would be able to evaluate a plumbing system based on what's in that international performance code for the building. And because it's so broad and it's so, you shall have potable water, right? Those type of things. So that's where I'm still confused. And some of the things I'm throwing out to help others who are more expert in this to sort of maybe can highlight that for me or help me understand it better. Thanks.
Thank
Can
you.
I jump in with a quick definition of performance and outcome, just to clarify before we go back to the list?
Sure.
In the Pacific Northwest, we have performance pathways in code, and actually most of the codes have performance pathways, and that's a modeling pathway, energy. It's a modeled pathway, and there's no enforcement after the model is submitted. So there's no check as to whether the model is accurately predicting performance. And so since we're talking about checking after the fact of actual outcome, we coined a new term of outcome-based code. So prescriptive is just do this. Performance is a model that says that we think the building is going to perform this way, and outcome is how it actually performs. And that's the distinction in this case.
Thanks for that. I want to go to Kim next.
Yeah, and I think the distinction is helpful, performance versus outcome. But I guess I'm trying to figure out, Brian, if there is ICC looking to get more jurisdictions doing performance, and I'm applying a little blind here because I haven't gotten a chance even to scroll through what's in the current performance code, but focusing on the way we use it in energy, performance, the way it's been categorized primarily, is about modeling against a baseline, not modeling against or even attempting to predict what will come out the end. And, if we're going to apply that same model, that same idea of performance to something like plumbing, I think you're getting into risky territory, because there are certain criteria you need for potable water that you can't try to estimate. You need to have them. So are we talking more about an outcome or a performance-based code?
Yeah, so thanks for that. And maybe I'll jump in before I go to Michael, Chris, and Amy. I think this discussion is exactly, why we're looking at this, because different disciplines have different expectation of what performance-based means or outcome-based means. There's different tools for predicting performance or measuring outcomes. And to the point about the ICCPC, it was originally developed at a time where, to be quite honest, energy performance, plumbing systems and others weren't really well developed or high on the agenda. It was structured in a way that seemed to work at the time for structural engineering and fire protection engineering, but was left at a very kind of qualitative stage for other disciplines, and it doesn't consider sustainability, energy, plumbing, or some of the other disciplines to a good enough degree. So one issue is that, a lot of the world seems to be going towards performance-based regulation, and we, in the broad sense, haven't really embraced it, in the built environment, except in some different specific disciplines. So we're trying to understand, where things are going in the different disciplines. Is a performance or outcome-based structure a good way to move forward? And if so, what would need to be done to achieve that? So, part of the background materials, which of course, not everybody has the same understanding or has looked at all the documents, but part of the conception of the performance-based code structure is that you just generally have a hierarchy from kind of a societal goal of, we'll use the potable water of safe drinking water for people. There should be a functional kind of statement of how you achieve that in buildings, but then some specific performance requirements, which in my view should include measurable values that would define what good performance means. And I think this question of performance-based versus outcome-based and how it's modeled or predicted or monitored over time is important, because the building code in many ways stops once the certificate of occupancy is given. So looking at outcomes, which would imply monitoring and reporting, introduces a new kind of attribute to the code structure. So the intent is really to try to understand how different people are viewing this and different disciplines are dealing with it, to understand if there is to be an effort to, reimagine the performance code, is the language we're using even appropriate, and kind of what needs to be done to get there. So it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think this discussion points to the fact of why we need this discussion, because we don't have a lot of commonality yet in understanding, let alone being able to structure a well-performing document or set of documents.
Your statement implied a different definition of performance code than the energy people are defining or are used to. Could you clarify, when you say measure, do you mean outcome after the building is built, something is measured, or do you mean somehow mathematically modeled or predicted measured?
Yeah, so largely the way it's been done historically in the broader, building regulated environment, it's more based on performance based on testing and performance based on modeling, and not performance, say 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years into the future, which is, how I understand outcome based in the energy side, because you actually have to measure performance to see if you're meeting your objectives. So for structural engineers, fundamentally, it's easy that if the building doesn't fall down upon completion, you're meeting the performance objectives for stability under basic gravity loads. For things such as performance of energy and use, it's a different issue, the same as it is for fire. So I think there is a difference in definition, which is why we're trying to kind of tease out, can we get to common definitions, or is it really different between the disciplines? Michael, you had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of really good points raised here. And I'm very supportive of an outcome-based performance code. A lot of people are referring to those as building performance standards lately. I kind of like the second term better, because I feel like the outcome-based or the performance standard is not a replacement for a design and construction code. Just like we don't want to rely on keeping our fingers crossed that the building stands up in an earthquake or doesn't burn down, we also want to make sure that the building is built to be energy efficient at its start. And just relying on something down the road, when Mark brought up a good point, the operation and unregulated loads can, dwarf the asset of the building itself. So I think having some level of performance determined at the time of design and construction is something that we need to maintain in the performance code. And there was also some discussion about energy models not predicting outcomes very accurately. And I agree with that, but part of the reason is that the energy models that are created for code compliance are not designed to do that. There are things in the rules for energy modeling code compliance that conflict with accurate predictions, like assumptions of default loads and schedules, assumptions that all spaces need to be heated and cooled, assumptions that fans need to run all the time when the building's occupied. So if we want to have a performance-based energy model that's more predictive, we need to design it so that it fills that goal, and not just hope that a model done for a different purpose is going to predict future energy use.
Great, thank you. There's quite a few people, so I'll jump over to Amy and then back to Philip and then to Jim.
Thanks, Brian. So I think Mike made a lot of good points, and others as well. And I just want to touch upon, I think, kind of something that Mike just brought up, talking about what it really means. And so I think in order for the energy side to really do any change, it does need to be outcome rather than a traditional performance. And, you know, Mike mentioned that relationship with building performance standards, and they really are basically outcome-based codes. And so it's something that, you know, is an opportunity to look at that from a little bit different way with the codes. Because I think, you know, some of the other things that have been mentioned here regarding how would you enforce, you know, Mark brought up, you know, delayed certificate of occupancy. Well, I can't imagine talking to the development community, you know, at large about how, you know, pushing that back, right? So, I mean, I can. And I think, you know, we're talking about a lot of these things that require a major shift in current, like bureaucratic how things are already done right now, right? So talking about moving back certificates of occupancy or developers who they sell off the building and what's their legal requirement if something doesn't perform. So I think, you know, coming at it from two different points, you know, as Mike said, having a performance or just, you know, the basics in the code and then looking at it from the building performance standards makes a lot of sense. And then one last thing, just talking about different disciplines and how they change. You know, I wouldn't really know how plumbing would be performance other than talking about potable water, but there's a lot more to plumbing than that. And I don't know how you would be looking at the outcome of that. But, you know, with like, you know, this is a group that's also talking about mechanical, some of that looks at, say, ventilation standards where there's an option to look at, you know, IAQ prediction, and there's modeling involved in that, but actually testing IAQ after the point, instead of just doing like a ventilation rate procedure, is going from that predictive to a performance level. And again, as IAQ has become so much more in the news lately, I think that there is a good opportunity now to kind of wrap that in as well, talking about actually making sure that there is a performance element or an outcome element of good air quality in buildings.
Thank you. Over to Philip.
I have to find myself. Am I muted?
No, you're good.
Oh, okay. I want to kind of piggyback on what Amy said. There are certain elements of building construction that are in fact testable and measurable, and those test results and measurements can end up going into simulations that are used for performance codes, and ventilation that Amy was just mentioning is one of those. So is air leakage of buildings, as is duct leakage from mechanical systems. All of these things are now measurable. They didn't used to be measured, but they're now measurable, and it's entirely possible to put specifications in performance codes that require that they be in certain levels in order to meet certain performances, and they get simulated in a way that makes the performance simulations more accurate. And the other point is, I think it was Mike that made this point, is that in order to have a performance code, you're basically comparing the proposed building with some reference standard that is going to be your standard code. And in order to do that fairly and accurately, you have to establish some kind of profile for how the building is actually used or expected to be used. And as soon as you establish that profile, there are going to be exceptions to that in the actual field where those performances are not going to be equivalent to the performance that was demonstrated in order to comply with the code. So there's lots of issues that are associated with performance codes that everybody's brought up here. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to Jim. You've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, Jim Kenzel with ASA again. I think, okay, number one, I think we definitely need to define what we're talking about at some point if this is ever going to work, right? So we definitely need a definition of performance standard, because there appears to be a different way of looking at it depending on what sector or who's using it or what have you. So that's a given. I don't know what the answer to that is. I'm just, highlighting that that's an obvious need that we have, is to have a clear definition of what a performance standard is. But I think, there are things that I think about that we've been doing specifically in the plumbing community recently And I'm familiar with ASHRAE 90.2 and I'm involved with it. And I understand the pathways that have been developed and different pathways that you can use to get to a certain outcome for energy efficiency and all that. I get that. But it's not that it can't be used in plumbing. I'm using it as an example in my mind. I recently had the opportunity to chair a group that developed a model code for water recycle systems. And the real basic measurement or performance criteria for those systems was based on that system to be able to do a certain log reduction of a given contaminant, right? And it almost has been set up as sort of a black box. And if you get this certain log reduction at the end, you're good to go. And I think as I listen to other people talk about it from an energy perspective or a fire perspective on a building system, that's the type of concept I think we're talking about here. And so, I mean, we have worked on, for instance, in the plumbing, we're now working at ASHRAE on a building system water management system standard, which is really talking about the entire building system and defining specific outcomes for that system as it relates to the water. And do we call it a performance standard? No, it's more of a management system standard. But I think and again, if folks can jump in, I think that maybe the plumbing industry and us have been sort of heading that way, and what more the energy people have been talking about in performance. I think we're closer together than maybe what we're all thinking when we talk about using management systems based on having those management systems set with specific objectives and goals for compliance and system standards that have a end performance of a given log reduction, for instance, from a public health safety standpoint. So we've been doing those type of things and working on those type of things. And again, the biggest issue with that has been now going to your local plumbing code official who's saying, wait a minute, it's either that product is certified already to a given standard and I look for the certification mark and we're done. You can't ask me to evaluate these things because I don't have the knowledge to do that. And so anyway, I'll be quiet for a while, but I think, and I'm really talking out loud simply as I'm sort of brainstorming in my own mind, trying to capture what I think everybody else is saying around performance standards and where I think maybe we are as an industry in plumbing. So thanks for listening.
Oh, thank you very much. And again, this is all part of the process. And, you know, what would be really helpful to me, and I think, you know, to the overall process, is for those of you who are working in these particular areas or the areas within which you're working, if you have a set of operational definitions that you're using for performance-based code, for outcome-based code, for performance-based standard, whether you're looking at, you know, a management system approach or, you know, a verification of performance for compliance versus verification of performance based on outcome, or whatever it is, you know, providing, you know, that type of input to the process to help sort through this, you know, would be helpful. And particularly, you know, for me, I'm not in the energy or MEP area, you know, just pointers to, you know, documents that may be at PNNL or DOE or within the different groups that maybe have a taxonomy that is generally used is helpful, because that can then be shared with others as well. So that's just kind of a general request, but, you know, this is again why we have these discussions, because, you know, if you can think that we don't have common terminology within a group that has significant overlap, you know, wait until we get talking to fire protection engineers and structural engineers and others in a large group trying to, you know, draft a framework document that would be called a, you know, code, and it's going to take some work to get there. So let me jump back to Kim and then back to Mark.
Thanks. One of the things I was thinking here, listening, I guess sort of another question for the framing of this conversation is, if we think some sort of like performance or testing or modeling, or outcome, but I'm sort of going to leave that one to the side. So like traditional, the way we have thought about performance, if we think that that path through the codes is superior, is it the best thing to update the performance code, or is it the best thing to update the other codes to have performance options? And the reason I'm asking that question is it's already hard enough to get the base codes adopted. And I think, Brian, you started this conversation saying that, and I didn't write this down, but no one in the United States uses the performance code. So unless there's going to be some large push to get the performance code adopted, what's sort of the path forward here? I mean, if we can come up with these performance code ideas, or, I guess some of them already exist, there is a performance code. Is it adopted internationally at some level that we should have some understanding of? Is why not just write these into the base code?
Yeah, so those are all good questions, and I'll jump in a little bit before I go back to Mark and to Dan. But it's, to answer the question, there's no code development activity particularly planned at the moment. The idea is to kind of look at the situation in the US and see where we're at. Part of that is driven, though, because there are a number of countries around the world which have performance-based building regulatory structures in place. There's an international group called the IRCC, which is made up of 15 countries that either have implemented or developed performance-based building regulations. And in many of those countries, the performance or functional regulation that sits at the top is, it's like, 1/10 of the size of the IBC, let alone all the other IMC and IEC and so forth. And there's different compliance pathways, but the aim is that if you can adequately describe the performance you're achieving, there should be a number of routes to demonstrate that that performance has been met, which allows for innovation and actual advancement of different societal objectives. And in most of those countries, or in fact all of them, there's always what's called a deemed to satisfy compliance approach, which is basically the prescriptive code that is used as one alternative. And that's probably used, 90% of the time. But there's often buildings or systems or features which you want to do something a little bit different. So I don't think there's any preconception that, we have to turn the system in the US upside down. But if you think of it the other way, if we can't really define what we mean by performance and outcome, then when you're trying to do an alternative method or material design to the prescriptive code, you don't even have a framework for, working with the code official there. So a big part of it is, it's not even clear we have all the tools that we need to be able to, appropriately incorporate these into the prescriptive, let alone try something different. And so regardless of the structure going forward, I think the discussion is how do we do a better job at getting better performance and better outcomes? What does that mean, and what works best in the US? So that's kind of my perspective on why we're looking at this. And it's not really a preconceived outcome, what direction we're going to go in at this time. So Mark, then Dan, Roy, and Michael.
Thanks. This is Mark Frankel from Ecotope again. I just want to respond to a couple of things and then make a couple of points. So first of all, I agree with Mike that building performance standards is a good way to talk about an outcome-based code, and maybe it's simpler to understand. And honestly, that's the way jurisdictions that are adopting those are talking about it. So we can kind of think of those as a similar thing. To Kim's point, I think, you know, in Seattle, which has a pretty strong use of the performance pathway, only about 5% of the buildings use it. So it's still a rare thing to use the performance pathway. On the other hand, Boulder, the city of Boulder, requires 100% of their commercial buildings to use the performance pathway. So there are, you know, there are examples. When we talk about model accuracy, I agree with Mike and Chris that the way we've set up the performance pathway in code to prevent manipulation, we have a whole bunch of fixed values that are not really representative of actual building performance. And that's what we need to sort of compare to a baseline. But you need to recognize that as jurisdictions adopt building performance standards for existing buildings, there's going to be incentive for the developers to actually do modeling to make sure they're not at risk of performance or an outcome-based enforcement down the road. And I think there's a risk if we focus too much on modeling for code without following up with some sort of feedback on outcome or the actual performance, that there's a risk that the code will become less relevant because the developers are moving towards the requirements of the building performance standard. Yes, they're going to meet code, but the model they use to meet code in a performance pathway is only relevant if it's actually predictive of the enforcement that's coming down the road under the building performance standard. So to give an example, in Washington, we have the Clean Buildings Law, and it sets EUI requirements for all buildings over 50,000 square feet. And it's meant to be updated over time to become more stringent to basically drive performance down. And a building that doesn't meet the EUI targets adopted by the law is forced to do a full audit and put together a plan and implement performance improvements to meet the requirements. And that's a pretty big lift for an existing building. But the thing is that for new buildings, the requirements are more stringent. So that a building that's completed today within 5 years will be subject to a much more stringent EUI requirement than just an existing building. And if you think about a developer that meets code and has done his due diligence on meeting code, and then, you know, within 3 to 5 years discovers that his building doesn't meet the performance standard, he has to go back in and do a full upgrade. That's a big wake-up call for developers, and they're going to want to make sure that they're doing predictive due diligence to make sure that they're on a pathway to meeting the secondary requirements of the Clean Buildings Law. And a variety of cities around the country have adopted building performance standards like this. And so to me, it's sort of like taking the place of enforcement. And there's a huge opportunity for the code to understand that jurisdictions are enforcing outcomes down the road and try to make a linkage so that they're setting those buildings up for success instead of ignoring that opportunity. And then one last thing with respect to enforcement, I mentioned the temporary certificate of occupancy. That was actually something proposed by NBI a couple of years ago to ICCPC, and it met a lot of resistance for the reasons Kim mentioned. I think a performance bond might be a simpler thing, but when you have a, potential enforcement by another entity, like in this case, the state of Washington, you almost don't need a performance bond because they're going to be in trouble if they have an EUI problem down the road. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thanks very much for that, Mark. Before I go to Dan, just a comment that there are, I think, some concepts similar to what you're talking about with the temporary certificate of occupancy. If you look at New Zealand, for example, they have what's called a building warrant of fitness requirement, where the building owner is required to certify every year that they're meeting the performance objectives that were identified for the building, and they're subject to audit. So there are some mechanisms in use in other places that can help to get to some of these issues as well that we want to explore as we look at this effort. So I'll jump over to Dan.
Yes, good afternoon. So as a enforcer, the performance code does, raise a lot of the flags that have been brought up. And to the point about, why doesn't this go into the current prescriptive based codes? Or, my point is this, is that if a jurisdiction wants to adopt a performance-based code. They have to, prepare what I'll just categorically phrase as the back end, which is a robust building department that is willing to take on this additional latitude in total performance and have the inspection and review and expertise available to them, whether it's through employees or through contract consultants or a process to accept third parties much more than is probably traditionally seen in many of the jurisdictions that you deal with. And the business proposition to all of that is that if we add this to the codes, you probably slow down an adoption process in 90% of the jurisdictions that do the adoptions. As a previous employee of the New York State Building Standards and Codes Division that did code adoption for the entire state, something like that would probably get shuttered for a statewide adoption, because 95% of the jurisdictions wouldn't be able to touch the horsepower that's needed in the back end to do the code review and the adoption. And then, as it gets handed off to how does the building get maintained in the future. So I think that's a good reason why this kind of stands on itself. I also believe that the performance code does look to the unsiloing, if you will, of the different code books. The mechanical looks at the mechanical, the fire guys look at the fire stuff, the egress people, the AED with the highly prescriptive based requirements. And this kind of starts to tear down some of those requirements. So as we look to things like weekly smoke control fan testing as compared to energy conservation, if we're going to suck the heat out of the building twice a week, I'm not sure what we accomplish on the energy side. And I think the performance-based design and the goals that are set out for the building performance are only captured in a performance-based design, not under the current code requirements. So like the last speaker said, I'll stop there and go listen to what everybody thinks. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Helpful perspectives. I want to jump over to Roy.
Yes, I was curious what an ICCPC would look like for electrical. I see you said the IBC references NFPA 70, which is what we use at OVO. And many years ago, maybe a decade ago, I took an ICC class for fundamentals for energy, and there's many things in there electrical. But a lot of those things are covered by the NFPA, and what we've done is we've added our OVO code supplements to describe what our intent is for all those. Is there a master ICCPC for electrical?
Yeah, so at this point in time, there's not. The idea of the ICCPC was that it would have the overall performance objectives for buildings, but it could be that one compliance pathway would be, for example, following the IBC or the IMC as appropriate, or the NEC for electrical. So this fits in a little bit to what I was saying earlier, that at the time the ICC performance code was developed, some areas were not all that well advanced. And so some of the performance functional requirements and performance requirements are a bit vague and don't provide a lot of detail. And so a lot of work would need to be done to kind of connect up to what would be performance expectations. And I think, for electrical, there's a wide range from, energy performance to safety. On the safety side, not causing, electrical shock and, to people using the systems and everything else. And you always will need some connection to a methodology or a standard or a guide that would show you how you could achieve that. And for some things, you won't necessarily have an easy way to predict, it'll be much easier to have a prescriptive or easy to follow solution. So the level at which different performance expectations might be met in the overall, building as a system, I think will vary a little bit between systems. And electrical for sure is one area that hasn't gotten much attention in the original ICCPC and would need to be looked at more robustly if there were to be an activity in that area going forward.
Thank you.
Yep. Jump over to Michael and then back to Jim.
So this comment is about the predictive performance approach modeling. And I agree, somebody was mentioning how, it puts a much bigger burden on jurisdictions, and that's a big challenge. I think what we need to do is make it so that it's not more of a burden on jurisdictions. And there's a few things going on to help that right now. The first thing is, I always like to say that a performance energy code or a model simply defines a different set of prescriptive requirements. So whatever you end up putting in your model is what is now prescriptively required. So there needs to be a tie-in between what's in the model and what a building official needs to look at, which they're used to doing, right? Once they have the list of things they need to verify, that's the job they're used to doing at the plans and in the building itself. So that tie-in is something that needs to be done much better, and we're working on that a little bit at PNNL right now with some new compliance forms and tools. The other thing is we can't expect building officials to be energy modeling experts. So there's a new ASHRAE standard 229 that is about verifying the implementation of modeling rule sets. So the idea is that energy models software will just submit reports, input and output reports, into a rule set checking tool that will automate the process of verifying that the model is done correctly and spit a report out for the building official. So building officials won't be expected to be modeling experts because it's unrealistic to think that they will. One more thing that came up earlier was about this deem to comply approach, which prescriptive requirements. The problem with the energy code is that, in an attempt to let everybody play in the field, the prescriptive path does not define a level of performance. You could have a ground source heat pump, or you could have electric resistance heat, and the latter will probably use 3.5 times as much energy as the ground source heat pump. And we allow wood frame buildings and metal buildings, and the metal building has much more heat loss. So the performance really, really varies depending on what prescriptive options you choose. So if we want to constrain energy performance, the prescriptive path needs to become much narrower. That deem to comply path needs to become much smaller than it is now. And that's going to push people towards more performance-based approaches.
Great, thank you. Jim.
Just a couple things, and I can't remember if it was in the material you provided, Brian, or if it was actually in the ICC performance code beginning or forward and all that, but it really emphasized somewhere in the information you provided, Brian, the importance of what I believe, I'm losing track of names here, and I can't, the gentleman who was saying and highlighting the fact of you've got to invest in your departments to make sure you have the right knowledge in your departments and the resources to do this. And that's basically what the information that part of the information you had provided, Brian, was saying is this whole thing requires a significant amount of training and knowledgeable people at the code official level to be able to implement this properly, right? So that's an important piece of this that I think we can never forget. It. If this performance concept is going to become valuable and usable in the US, then there has to be a commitment to the code and building official part of this puzzle to commit to that training. I sort of like what Michael was saying about, in a sense, what I heard Michael saying, at least from the energy standpoint, is take the performance modeling criteria and make it so that it's still rather prescriptive for the code official, right? And so that's an interesting approach. The other piece I was going to add is all the model codes I deal with, all the mechanical codes, the building codes, the plumbing codes, from both ICC, IAPMO, whatever, they always have a section at the beginning that basically talks about alternative methodologies. That if you wish to, if an individual wishes to use an alternative approach that is not in the prescriptive code, they have the ability to do that through the authorization of the authority having jurisdiction, right? Now, the problem is, and I think, Brian, you brought this up, and maybe this is where the performance code can really start to be a potential value in the US is, okay, what does that mean? What is the specific criteria around a mechanical system or a plumbing system or what have you? What is the minimum measurable criteria that needs to be met in that alternate method, right? So that the code official can at least have those outcomes to evaluate against when they're submitted those engineering drawings, those engineering specs from the professional engineer and what have you. So in a sense, we already have the ability for innovation built into the prescriptive codes. It's just not well defined right now. So that may be somewhere that this could become beneficial.
Thanks very much for that. I think that's part of
I
the.
did have Brian before. Just one question for I think it was Mark who was talking about Seattle and Oregon. Are those codes, performance codes you're talking about, are those energy building performance codes? Or are they overall performance codes for the building, including mechanical, plumbing, and what have you? I'm just curious.
They're energy performance pathways, so modeling pathways.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
And
So,
it's in ASHRAE 90.1. LEED uses
Right.
it. Washington, Oregon, California all have energy codes. There is a plumbing version, Appendix M, for plumbing performance. I'm not a plumber. I don't know as much about it. It's not my area of expertise, but I know at Ecotope we've used that pathway in Seattle a few times.
what is that
So,
appendix in, or what reference are you using for that
Appendix M, I
appendix?
think it is. That maybe some a plumbing expert on this could weigh in, but I think it's Appendix M, which is for sizing, pipe sizing and flow. It's a more performance-based calculation than the prescriptive.
Oh,
plumbing
that, yeah,
code.
that exists in the codes today. But anyway, okay.
Not many people allow it, however.
No, I understand. I understand.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's tied together a little bit. The code, I mean, the IBC alone, I haven't looked recently, is somewhere over 600 pages. To try to tease out the performance of the buildings we're looking for, it can be really difficult to do. And I think that's why, again, a lot of this discussion of, even if you want to do an alternative design, you need to know what the performance is you're trying to be equivalent to or better than. And for some disciplines, that can be pretty challenging. And so I think that's a big part of what we're trying to work through here over, the near future. Michael, did you have another question or comments?
No, just forgot to pull my hand down, sorry.
Nope, no worries. No, I'm just, looking at the time a bit. I know we got started a little bit late, but I'm also, conscious of the time that I, had allocated 90 minutes, and I don't want to run over or ask you to stay longer. But what I would like to try to get to a little bit as we're, getting to the end here. And some of these questions I think were already addressed, but I was trying to tease out a bit what the biggest challenges might be in getting acceptance of performance approaches. And part of it is, I think from the discussion today, we have different definitions, we have different understanding. I think to a certain extent, both the market and the regulatory officials charged with approving designs maybe don't both have the common understanding or all the tools they need. And so having more guidance, having more clarity, having more commonality would be really important. Is that, generally, one of the significant challenges that we face, and does anybody have anything they would add to that as, really, big challenges that should be tackled to get our arms around this? Kyle?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Kyle Thompson, PMI. I just wanted to, I was listening to our discussion. I agree with a lot of what was said. I wanted to share that during my standards development tenure, I had a chance to look back through really old standards that we were either looking at for examples or updating. And I'm talking about 45, 50 years ago that were developed. And then I think one of our greatest challenges, the reason I'm bringing this up, is that it seems like there was a trend in the past, a while ago. The idea, the overall theory behind development of standards was different than it is today. And that being, previously, it was a communication between technical people. They would develop they would set the standard up, say for a test. They would say, this is the reason that we're doing this test, and here's what we're looking for. And then they would describe, here's what the test is and the performance requirements. And I think we're battling against a trend that's been going on for 50 years to make it more and more and more like a cookbook, where now it's a communication from a technical person to staff that's just doing the function, measuring the flour and the sugar. And it's just do this, and then you have this. And so I think that's been a trend in both standards and codes development, where we're telling the building official, this is what it has to be. And so now we're trying to take a step in, going back to where here we're communicating, this is the performance that we're looking for. And, we're leaving it up to the building official to make that decision, and that personal responsibility, that thinking of, what has to be done is kind of gone, it's gone in a different direction. I think a lot of departments don't want that thinking taking place. They want to have, this is what you do, this is what you do. And because it's simpler, it's faster, and it costs less money. So I think one of our largest challenges is to overcome this trend of thinking and coming back to a more communicative exchange of information. And I see a lot of pushback that we can anticipate on that concept, that idea.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kyle. I mean, I would tend to agree there's been quite a shift in that direction. And, you can go back, I've looked at some of these things as well, and some work by HUD back in the 1970s in defining the performance concept, and originally Operation Breakthrough around, performance-based approach for housing, which at the time, started looking at a lot of these issues, and the national academies decided at that point, we weren't ready for it. Well, now we've gone to this a little bit to the point where, building officials and others, regulatory officials have had in my view, a mindset imposed on them that they're a business operation and they have to move quickly rather than to actually, engage in discussions. But also the market has kind of followed a little bit in that they'll take largely the path of least resistance. So if you tell them what they have to do, and they can do that 90% of the time, then they'll readily do it. And so when you have this 10% of the time, or hopefully even more, that you would actually like to engage in discussion on how to make better performing buildings, neither the market side nor the enforcement side is really structured in a way to make it happen in the most efficient way. So I think those are challenges that we have to get at. Any other comments on, on big challenges that we need to tackle, or, conversely, next steps that that should be taken to help move us down the road? Seeing none, let me then, kind of give everybody, the opportunity to go through in the last few minutes here and see if there's, kind of one or two things that they want to leave, everybody with, but importantly, leave me with, that I should look into and that we need to take into account as we, take the research forward on how we might move forward with promoting more on the performance side.
One thing I might suggest is figuring out what systems or elements of systems are subject to a performance path, because not all of them are, right? Even in plumbing, it'd be a subset. In electrical, I'm not sure what is a performance path for electrical. In energy, it's, there's been a lot of work and it's pretty obvious. So maybe sort of sorting out which systems we're targeting would be good.
Great, thanks. Anything else from anyone else that you haven't raised at this point? Okay, so what I would like to do then is to thank you all for your participation. I would again make a request that I made earlier on, in that, because you're expert in this area in MEP and energy, if you have, documents that, maybe not extensive documents, but at least overview documents that help understand, the issues from your perspective, the opportunities that are there, how we can learn in this process. If you're able to send me a link or a reference, that would really be helpful. I think this is a long-term process. We're just kind of looking at the issues now. Challenges exist around terminology and definitions, which need to be sorted out. A big one being, what we're talking about in terms of performance-based, outcome-based performance standards and the like, education and training and review. So there's a great deal of items that have been raised, which are, I think, consistent with other disciplines as well. So it's been really helpful. I think one last thing I would say, the intent of this particular roundtable was to really try to talk around some of these big picture issues and get a sense of what the issues are. If it would be helpful to have a second discussion that gets into some of the details around how performance or outcomes are actually modeled, predicted, measured in these areas going forward, we could set that up. But again, I don't want to impose too much on your time. It was envisioned to be structured in that way, where we could have a second discussion around more details, but I'll take my lead from you all in terms of whether we should try to do that. And then ultimately, later in this year or next year, once I've been able to have these roundtable discussions with different disciplines and different enforcement groups, there's an aim to try to have a bigger workshop, and with the intent of maybe providing a suggested framework for moving forward, and then seeing how those ideas play with the different groups. So Jim, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, just to give you a little input, Brian, on your question, from a personal standpoint, I would love to, at some point, sort of hear a couple presentations on performance codes that are actually been implemented whether in the US or given states or in Europe, wherever, I guess, that have been implemented successfully, and what do those codes look like, and what does the process look like that to how they're used? To me, that would be highly beneficial. But
Okay, that's good. I did send a rather late link or email yesterday that has a link to a Dropbox that I set up. And I did kind of an overview presentation on performance where it gives a few examples from England, New Zealand, Australia, and elsewhere. But there could be opportunities. We have a lot of international contacts to bring in a couple of people to talk about systems. Part of the challenge is that some of them are significantly different. So, if we can do this, we'll include a couple of presentations. I'm thinking maybe Australia and England could be a couple of good examples. So I'll definitely look into that. One last chance for any comments and feedback. And seeing none, I would like to thank you very much. It's been a very interesting discussion, a lot of good feedback. I think a good healthy mix of discussion of opportunities and concerns about how performance might be implemented going forward, and how we can do a better job. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.